Welcome back to the London Futurist Podcast. Today we have not one guest but two, Brett King and Robert Tercek, the hosts of the Futurist Podcast. Brett King is originally from Australia and is now based in Thailand. He's a renowned author and the founder of a breakthrough digital bank. He consults extensively with clients in the financial services industry. Robert Tercek, based in the United States, is an expert in digital media, with a successful career in broadcasting and innovation, which includes serving as a creative director at MTV and a senior vice president at Sony Pictures. He now consults to CEOs about digital transformation. David and I had the pleasure of joining them on their podcast recently, where we delved into the likely future impacts of artificial intelligence and other technologies, and we did talk about politics a bit. Brett, Robert, welcome to the London Futurist Podcast.
How nice to be here.
Thanks, Calum.
It's great to see both of you. Let me start with a question to Brett, if I may. Brett, what changes do you foresee in the financial services industry that our audience might not already be anticipating? For example, are cryptocurrencies going to disintermediate the traditional banks? Is quantum computing going to destroy the industry by cracking all the encryption around our financial data? Or are there other things that we should pay attention to?
Well, you got one right. Q-Day is going to be a disaster for the banking industry and anywhere else that there's sort of encrypted technologies. There's no absolute certainty that this is going to happen, but with the amount of money that's going into it at a state level, it's highly likely that we'll have Q-Day or Quantum Day, which is when we have a 100,000 qubit error-correcting quantum computer that can crack all existing encryption technologies.
What does your crystal ball tell you about the date of Q-Day?
I met the CEO of IBM at Leap, and unfortunately he wouldn't let me record the conversation. It was off the record, in that he said you could talk about it, but he didn't want to be on the air. He said 5 to 7 years for IBM to reach that milestone. That was from the CEO of IBM. The US military is spending $1 trillion on post-quantum encryption right now. JP Morgan Chase is spending $1 billion on it this year. Apple is investing in this. So you see some players getting ready for this, but most bankers I speak to would be completely unaware of it.
And what about the existing cryptocurrencies? Won't that be unlocked by quantum decryption? All the money that people have got stashed away?
Yeah, possibly. Although if you're in the cloud and you're on technology architecture that's cloud-based, you'll be able to fairly rapidly hook in quantum encryption into your stack. So if you operate in the cloud, you should have some protection from Q-Day using quantum itself. Most crypto from an operations perspective is cloud-based. So I think that there's some protection there, although Bitcoin and some of the other rails will have to be reinforced. I know Ethereum's working on this. I don't know what's happening in terms of Bitcoin Foundation. We should follow that up.
So your advice for our audience is move all resources into the cloud. Many people, of course, are fearful of such.
Well, if you're in banking or if you're in healthcare, you're going to have to be in the cloud to avail yourself of the high levels of automation and so forth that's there. But the really interesting thing for banking and financial services probably already happened, which is mobile phone-based banking, because that created this whole fintech movement or financial technology movement as we talk about it. And since 2014, you've had a number of new entrants come onto the market, both in the form of mobile wallets and challenger banks or neobanks like Revolut, Monzo, Starling, Nubank, WeBank, MyBank, etc. That's reshaping financial services. The top 20 fintechs have about 4 billion customers amongst them. The top 20 retail banks, about 2.8 billion. So already fintechs really dominate in sort of day-to-day space. And this includes obviously mobile wallet schemas like Alipay and WeChat Pay and M-Pesa and so forth as well. This means that today, if you ask the average person in the world what is their bank account, it won't be something that's issued from a bank in the classical terms. It'll be something that's built into their phone. And when AI comes into that infrastructure, that wallet infrastructure, with highly personalized money experiences, then the trajectory of that separation between traditional banking and digital autonomous banking will accelerate. And as we start thinking about AI-based agencies, autonomous operation of businesses, and so forth, obviously that's probably going to tend towards more technically capable platforms.
And when people talk about their net worth, will they still be referring to it in dollars or euros in traditional fiat currencies? Will they be referring to their wealth in crypto tokens or in some reputational counting system?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Dave Birch and I do a piece on this, a keynote on this, on what sci-fi tells us about the future of money. We were talking about this with Charlie Strauss on our last interview as well, Rob and I, about his model in Neptune's Brood. And he had this limitation in the market. Mankind had spread out to the stars, but transactions could only be sublight. There was no such thing as superluminal communication or things like that. That was the natural constraint on the trading market. Then you have the reputation economy represented in Black Mirror. You have various communist utopian and techno-utopian different models. But I think artificial intelligence is likely to automate so much of our money function in society, and that ultimately, if we apply that, money will be a poor source of value exchange and asset denomination. And I think we'll have to come up with something else, at least something hybrid.
Rob, do you and Brett tend to see eye to eye in these financial projections?
Oh, Brett and I agree on most things, but for the purpose of our show, we often have a lively debate. We think that's a more interesting way to discuss and maybe attack these questions. I think where Brett and I might differ is on a couple of points. I'm skeptical about national cryptocurrencies or so-called sovereign cryptocurrencies, and Brett is keenly interested in the subject. I can see that he knows a lot more about it than I do. And then second is the idea of a universal basic income.
Yeah.
This has been a source of lively debate for us since we began doing the Futurist Podcast a few years ago. Brett thinks it's inevitable, and I think it's one of the worst ideas in the world.
And techno unemployment generally.
But I think most of that just makes the show more interesting.
Yeah,
If we agree on everything, it's quite a boring conversation.
true.
You can agree on techno unemployment without agreeing on what the fix to techno unemployment is, whether UBI is sensible or not. Do either of you think there won't be technological unemployment?
Well, look, this is a perennial bogeyman that comes up every time there's a political season. And of course, we're well into that in the United States right now. But we have historic levels of employment. The unemployment rate is at the lowest it's been in my lifetime. So far, there's no evidence of technological unemployment. It's certainly true that every new technology is going to make certain jobs obsolete. That's certainly true, but that's been the case since the steam engine 300 years ago. So gradually, new technology will come that will displace certain jobs that are done by humans or previously by animals. But that's the nature of progress. That's also the nature of productivity gains. And if you want to have increased wages, the only way to pay for increased wages that's non-inflationary is to destroy jobs. So that's bound to happen. But the panic is that these reports come out. There's a report from the University of Oxford about 6 years ago that said that half of jobs could be automated. And then more recently, McKinsey came out with a similar report saying about 40% of jobs were subject to automation or replacement by artificial intelligence. It's really important to understand that they say that it's subject to, right? It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. And people make the assumption that that's happening right now, that's happening today.
No, it's not happening yet.
But it's a forecast. It might happen over time. So I think there's a fair bit of panic about that. And then we're jumping to conclusions about how we should address it. So far, there's no evidence of that happening.
Well, let's get back into that in a bit. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask you some questions, Robert,
Sure.
about your sort of specialist area, your mastermind specialist area.
Yeah.
With the tsunami of user-generated and machine-generated content flooding the internet, and with mainstream media distrusted by so many people, is traditional journalism dead, or can it stage a comeback?
That's a great question. That's really three questions in one, or three observations in one. There's no doubt there's a flood of user-generated content. That's certainly true. And so that makes the process of finding good content a little bit more difficult. In the age of Google, good or quality content is defined as whatever the user feels is quality. So if you find something that matches what you're searching for, then you're going to deem that good. So what we've got is this notion that high quality content is something that maybe an editor of a newspaper or the editor of a news magazine might feel is good enough for their publication. That decision's shifted now to the public. The public can determine what they think is good. There's some content out there that's going to appeal to just about everybody. Let's say there's content out there that flatters your biases. So what we really have is mass scale confirmation bias. That's definitely eroding confidence in mainstream media, because if there is kind of a mainstream media narrative about what is happening, and this is based on real journalism, facts, there's going to be a countervailing narrative generated somewhere in the blogosphere or in the social media sphere. And that countervailing narrative might actually flatter some people's political biases or their hard-held beliefs. So for those folks, they're going to find what they want. And yeah, that does threaten the credibility of journalism. But, let's note, there's more good journalism being produced today than ever before.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I had a conversation recently with a friend who wanted to believe in some posts by a complete lunatic that she'd come across on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, look, that flies very much in the face of what everybody from the FT, the Economist, the BBC, Times, Telegraph, everybody, New York Times, they're all saying the exact opposite of that. And she said, well, who the hell are you to tell me who's right and who's wrong? Why aren't my sources of information just as good as yours? And it's a tough argument to push back on. I mean, she's wrong. She's just flat out wrong. But how do I prove it? It's quite tricky.
Yeah, the problem is it takes so much time and effort to debunk fake news.
Yeah.
You could do it, and sometimes I get drawn into the debate, but I find it's a waste of time because, number one, you're not going to convince the person on the other side who posted that stuff. And number two, it's much harder to prove a proposition is false than it is to make a false assertion. People make false assertions all day long.
Yeah.
But to disprove that takes a ton of effort. We live in a time where there's a lot of stuff being said by a lot of different people. Some have credibility amongst their peer group, amongst their fan group. Others have broader credibility.
So the interesting question is mainstream media going to make a comeback in the sense that most people will say to themselves, actually, we've had a period of craziness, but from here on in, I'm going to assume that the New York Times isn't actively trying to mislead me. And I'll, on the whole, assume it's probably right if they write something. There's all sorts of caveats, but on the whole, that's probably okay. Or are we now doomed to an eternity in which nobody believes anything that they didn't already want to believe?
I think we live in a world where you can choose your own facts and you can choose your own source of news to confirm your opinion.
Then we're screwed.
Yeah.
Really, it's like choose your own reality. That seems to be the world that we're in, at least viewing it from the United States. That seems to be the water that we're swimming in right now.
I like to think these things go in cycles, though, and actually people will pull back from the batshit craziness that we've had.
I certainly hope you're right about that. What we see more happening here is our news media in the United States are going with the flow. They're becoming crazier and they're posting more outrageous stuff. What they'll typically do is wait until there's a little bit of a kerfuffle, some controversy around maybe some fake news or a fake meme or something. And then they report on that as if it's a news event. And that allows them to get the benefit of covering the sensational story, but also preserving their credibility. It's an interesting thing. We've had now 25 years of digital disruption in media. And the media companies that have survived that, many have gone away. Many have gone out of business or they've been acquired or merged. The media companies that have survived have actually transformed. I'll give you an example. You mentioned the New York Times, which in the U.S. is viewed by many people as the paper of record. Others would say that the Wall Street Journal is, but those are our two big national newspapers here. The New York Times today isn't really a newspaper in the sense that it was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Today, the New York Times is a game publishing company that has a kind of Amazon-like reviews section called Wirecutter. And that's what drives the revenue for their digital publication. And on the side, they happen to own a newspaper called the New York Times. So it's a complete inversion. Now, this is a success case. So the New York Times is viewed as a really successful digital transformation project. But bear in mind, what's driving the revenue isn't the news. And that was also the case for broadcasting in the United States for 50 years. News was a lost leader. So maybe that's the way to look at it. Real news that requires real journalism, like real work to produce, might not be such a profitable business on its own.
So should governments be spending more money to support somehow independent news like the British BBC?
That's a contradiction in terms, isn't it? Government supporting independent.
Well, you can pay to the BBC and then stand off.
Those are fighting words in this world. We don't have a mechanism like BBC, unfortunately, in the United States.
Well, you have the NPR.
Yeah, but the funding mechanism there, not that your audience is going to be interested in this, but it's a very American approach to public media. Basically, we go as far as we can to not fund it. It's minimal, public broadcasting and PBS. It's very different from the BBC. I think, frankly, you have a better system in the UK.
Well, it's certainly the case that lots of people who go on YouTube and so on, like we're doing now, find that the more sensationalists we are, the more of an audience we get, the more clicks we get.
Yeah.
So people start off by occasionally saying dodgy things about, I don't know, vaccines or birth controversies or the heritage of various people, and they get more clicks, and some of them sell their souls to that.
Mm.
And so the commercial environment is encouraging people to be less focused on news and more focused on, quote, entertainment, which sadly drives more people crazy.
So, David, are you suggesting that we should be talking more about J.D. Vance's couch affections and his socks?
Well, we're not after as many clicks as possible. We're after a different kind of influence.
I just think it's so funny.
I'm glad that our election provides amusement for the UK.
Well, as a lot of people have said, in the last few days, or is it, I don't know, 2 weeks, it's all going so fast, the Democrat Party's starting to have fun again.
Yeah.
They haven't had fun for years. So, yeah, it's all very entertaining and not just totally depressing.
They tend to be over earnest. It's true. There's new life in this party. Brett and I were just chatting about that last week. It went from a kind of preordained conclusion to now a real fight. The polling is very close with the new candidate. Of course, that's injected new energy and new enthusiasm, and also young people are responding to Kamala Harris's entry. It makes a much more entertaining project.
She's 59, so she's young by Biden and Trump standards, but she's not exactly young. But she's obviously a lot more dynamic than Trump or Biden. It does make it interesting.
And she's memeable.
Yeah.
She says silly things. She dances. She's got a sense of humor.
Her social media team's pretty good, actually.
So what does this tell us about the future of politics?
Oh, it looks like fun.
I can only imagine what it looks like outside the United States.
So let's go back to the conversation that you started, Rob, before I so rudely interrupted you, about technological unemployment. I've heard you and Brett talking about this. And I agree with you about some of what you're saying, because I think UBI is a terrible idea for the moment, but I think it may be an inevitable idea if and when we get to technological unemployment. But what you were raising was the possibility that that will never arrive. And that's a position which I find odd, because it seems to me if we keep developing AIs, if they keep getting smarter and smarter, which we will, we're not going to stop, unless there's some ceiling that they can't get beyond for some reason, unless there's a law of physics that says you have to have 3.5 pounds of goop inside your skull to get to a certain point and silicon can't do it, then they are going to get to the point where they can do everything that we can do for money, cheaper, better, and faster than we can. And at that point, there'll still be lots of new jobs. What's always happened in the past, automation and creating new types of jobs, that will carry on happening. It's just that the new jobs won't be taken by humans, they'll be taken by machines. Because there's always a machine that can do it cheaper, better, and faster. I'm not necessarily saying this is going to happen tomorrow, but does that not persuade you?
No, it doesn't persuade me. It doesn't persuade me at all. I'm totally unpersuaded by that argument.
So what do you think is going to stop them? What do you think is going to stop them overtaking us?
No, look, you've used these AI tools as they are today, and I know they keep getting better and they improve at a rapid clip. But to argue that this is intelligence that can be autonomous and take our jobs as if it has some kind of malicious intent, that's ascribing an awful lot of autonomy to a system that doesn't have it today. And there's no real evidence we're going to get there. Many people speculate about general intelligence. Perhaps we'll get there someday. I'm very skeptical that we're going to get there with large language models.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the case at all. If you believe that, then of course what I'm saying won't make any sense to you. But I don't think we're likely to get to AGI with the current methods. If that changes in the future, then some of the things you're talking about might be true. In the short run, I find AI requires human input. It requires a human to steer it. It requires a human to tell it what to do. It requires human discernment to decide whether the results are valid and useful or need to be edited or redone.
It does at the moment, but it may not do in the future at some point.
And at that point, we should worry about it, I suppose.
Doesn't AI already have a combination? It's got the large language models that's generating ideas, which may or may not be valid, but it's got increasingly rational parts to its brain as well. Isn't this the idea of Gemini? Google's choice of the name is that there's a kind of a twin. There's the rational part which can fact check and sanity check. Will humans like this or not? Along with the other part, which is creative.
Yeah.
And that's how human teams work anyway. We've got young, creative people who we won't let control of the company, but my goodness, they come up with some interesting ideas. And then there's the grey hairs who say, well, these 9 ideas are rubbish, but this 10th one is wonderful. Let's go with it. So we may not get to AGI with large language models by themselves, but there's so many people spending money on combination systems.
You don't need AGI to have technology disruption. This is where I disagree with Rob a little bit. The greatest productivity tool we will ever have is going to be AI when it comes to employment. And if you listen to Sam Altman, he talks about 5-person unicorn businesses and things like that. For the techno guys in Silicon Valley and for many capitalists, the most efficient form of an Uber company is going to be a driverless autonomous car. That's going to be the most productive you can make that company. And I think that's the mindset of the Silicon Valley capitalists. Get rid of the humans and make these businesses as efficient as possible. Elon Musk already does it with the Gigafactory. They're telling us what they want to do. They want to create an entire system of production and market operation that is humanless corporations. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be jobs for humans. But this is where, in my book, Technosocialism, I focused on the fact that the role of work in society must change as a result of this. If all of the market, economic, production, factory, transport, healthcare type stuff is heavily automated, what is it left for humans to do? And there is going to be plenty. Climate change, for example, is going to be a massive employer. But that has to change the way we think about the structure of our markets, because the profit-driven element will be highly automated, and it will be the purpose-driven and big picture stuff that humans are left doing, which I don't necessarily think will be paid for in the way we are today. It may not be UBI. It may be a completely different system.
Look, I think where we agree is whatever can be automated will be automated.
Yeah.
I wrote about that 10 years ago, and I still think that's the case. But that doesn't mean everything will be automated. That's the leap that some people make that I refuse to make.
But why not? What's the impediment that is going to stop everything being automated?
Okay, when we talk about automating jobs, think about the jobs that people actually do. We have e-commerce now, so we have vehicles coming to our houses, dropping off packages. Do you really think that's going to be automated? Do you really think that there'll be robots or drone deliveries? We hear about these fantasies from Silicon Valley, but the reality is that that's very difficult to do. That's a very hard problem to solve. Just autonomous vehicles. A moment ago, Brett was talking about that. We've been hearing about autonomous vehicles since the year 2000. It's 2024.
And they're working. They're working in San Francisco, Austin, and Phoenix. They work just fine.
They're working somewhat. They haven't taken the world by storm.
Well, no, not somewhat. They're working just fine. Waymo is rolling out very, very cautiously, which is entirely right and proper, because we don't mind killing millions of people with human drivers, but we really object to being run over by a robot.
Yeah.
So they're being very smart and rolling it out very slowly. But in those 3 cities, there are virtually no problems.
Right. It's a promising pilot project. To take that example with transportation and then leap to the assumption that all truck drivers are going to be unemployed, that's a pretty big assumption. It might happen someday in the future, but it's not happening imminently. The same is true for construction. The same is true for any kind of maintenance. The same is true for anyone who works with machine tools. Now, factories that can be automated, back to the point I was making, whatever can be automated will be automated. It's true that the body factory, the body plant for any automotive factory today is entirely robotic. So if it can be automated, in other words, if the job that you happen to be doing today can be done by a machine, it's going to be done by a machine. That's a certainty. And that means in terms of our own individual decision-making about our careers, we have to think carefully about what parts of what we do can be automated. And just to build on the point David was making 5 minutes ago, but I think it's a really important point to underscore, the right way to approach this, I think, is to look at these tools and say, how can they help me do a better job at what I do? How can they help me be more effective or more efficient? How can they help me make better decisions and adopt them? Now, that's human working in concert with technology. That's a human who's got superpowers thanks to the technology. It's not a human who's being displaced. That's not a human who's going to be unemployed. That's a human who's going to earn more because they're more productive. At least this is the way I choose to look at it.
And I'm sure you're right for the next few years, or at least months, probably years, and maybe decades. But the point is, unless we stop making them smarter and better, or unless there's some ceiling, a glass ceiling for robots that they can't get through, they are going to overtake us in capability on every level. And whether that's 2 months away or whether it's 25 years away, we ought to be thinking about what the economy looks like after that.
Yeah. How do we transition it?
Because we haven't got a plan at the moment. It's a really important question.
Well, we never do have a plan. Humans don't have a plan until the change is upon us, and then there's chaos and we adapt.
Yeah, that has been our process before. But of course, the disruption this time would be much greater. The change is going to be much greater.
But I think, Calum, you'll see economies compete on the basis of applied intelligence. I call them smart economies. And in these economies, you'll have much higher rates of technology unemployment and automation because it becomes the core growth factor.
Yeah.
But I think at some point, we're hearing a lot of talk about degrowth economies and things like that at the moment. And even you go back to the 72 Club of Rome stuff, that level of automation also must require some sort of philosophical changes in human society. And that's the tricky bit.
So you outlined a vision of that future, didn't you, Brett, in your book, Techno-Socialism?
Yes.
Could you share with our listeners a précis of that?
So I wish I'd renamed it to techno-socialism versus neo-feudalism or something, because the socialism term made a lot of people uncomfortable. But I basically mapped out, and I had a few different people assess me. One was a world-leading economist and specialist in corporate stuff, Dr. Richard Petty. But in that model, we basically mapped out 4 future potentials for humanity. And that is techno-socialism or techno-optimism, where you use technology to expand human intelligence and solve all the problems of the world, climate, diseases, cancer, live longer, etc. Then you have where you have inequality and capitalism gets baked in. And so you have the rich get access to the best technologies and the best longevity treatments and things like that. And the poor have to live on some sort of basic income structure. And then you have failed systems and you have techno-Ladistan type scenarios where because of the effect that high level of automation will have, there sort of be a backlash. So we think those 4 systems will sort of all happen simultaneously in different places in the world. But we've had this debate. We had this with Charlie Stross the other night on the show. We've talked with David Brin about this and so forth. And when you ask the science fiction guys and the futurists, what's the chances that we're going to get through this? A consistent theme that keeps coming up is unless humanity can get off this economic system that we're in, that we have a high chance of extincting the human species. And that's really what the book was about. That conversation is, how do we as a species go to the next level using these tools that are emerging, given the chaos we see today? The inequality, emerging climate change problems, the potential disruption of AI, pandemics, and so forth.
And Rob, I'm guessing you don't agree with that. I'm guessing that you're more wedded to a capitalist approach.
Well, where I do agree with Brett is that we are living in a world of increasing complexity. And we need all the intelligence at our disposal to solve the complex problems that are coming at us. The problems are getting harder, not easier. And candidly, we're not good at solving these problems. Just to build on what Brett was just saying, mostly the way our politicians seem to work, and certainly the way any business person works in the capitalist economy, is that they tend to double down on what worked well yesterday, hoping that tomorrow will be the same. And I think that premise is increasingly unlikely going into the future. So if you'll accept my conviction that we are living in a time of increasing complexity, ever lengthening supply chains, geopolitical complexity, climate complexity, economic complexity, technological complexity, and social complexity, and all these factors interweave, then we are going to need technology to help us solve the problem. We're going to need artificial intelligence to help us make better decisions. And this is where I think Brett and I are in total sync. When we look at artificial intelligence, many people have the habit of thinking it's going to take something away. It's going to take my job. It's going to take my data. It's going to take my autonomy. It's going to take away my agency and so forth. That feels like a dreadful loss. That's why people are opposed to artificial intelligence. But we're not as good at imagining what artificial intelligence might confer upon us. In other words, what will it give us? Not what will it take away, but what will it give us? And I believe it will give us superpowers. I believe artificial intelligence will confer upon us the ability to understand complex problems and perceive solutions and identify patterns that we could not see with our own human faculties because we're limited. And the proof of that is that we have so many crises today. We have this sort of growing polycrisis around the world of interlocking challenges that humans cannot solve. So candidly, I say bring on the intelligence, bring on the machines. We need all the help we can get. And frankly, there's a deficit of intelligence. Just look at the discourse in the United States in this election right now. And you could say, bring on the machines, because the human politicians, they don't have the good answers. And frankly, they don't even know how to describe the stuff that we're talking about right now.
Beam me up, Scotty. There's no intelligent life down here.
I like your exhortation to people to be open to a more optimistic set of forecasts about AI. And I agree with you. I think that there's enormously exciting benefits that it can generate. And oddly, actually, you and I disagree about the future of technological unemployment. I'm very hopeful about a world in which humans don't have to do jobs anymore. I'm very hopeful about a world in which machines have taken all the jobs. They won't take all the work because humans will always work. We just won't get paid for it.
Yeah.
Because whatever job there is that could get paid for, there's going to be a machine that can do it cheaper, better, and faster than a human. And I don't know whether that's in 10 years' time or 50 years' time or 100 years' time. I don't know. But I do think that is going to happen unless, as I say, there's some reason that is stopping them from evolving. And I think that could be a great thing because report after report have shown that only about 15% of people really enjoy their work, really enjoy it and get a lot of meaning out of it. Most people do their jobs in order to put food on the table. And it might give them a reason to get up in the morning. It might put some structure in their life. It might give them a label to attach to themselves at parties. You know, what do you do? I'm a plumber. But I don't suppose many plumbers get existential meaning out of being a plumber. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe being a plumber is the most exciting thing you can do.
I find craftsmen enjoy it because they're problem solvers. They're solving practical problems. They're helping people.
Yeah, that's fine. But I'll bet most plumbers, like most people generally, get their meaning from their friends and their family and maybe their religion and their ideas and their hobbies. I think that for most people, that's the case. And so if we can free ourselves of jobs, if there's no longer a 9 to 5, that's great. So I think that's one of the great things that AI can do for us.
Let's come back to your suggestion, Rob. We should be using intelligence, AI, to help us understand complex problems and propose solutions. But in reality, most companies that are developing AI aren't driven by such a vision. They're driven on how can we help persuade more people to click on more ads? How can we understand their behavior so we know what things to sell them? How can we keep an eye on military development so we can intervene in military solutions? How can we persuade people to gamble? Because all of these things are more immediately profitable or meaningful to whatever is driving them.
If you define AI as consumer media, sure. I think the criticism you're voicing is accurate. But there are artificial intelligences being deployed in pharmaceutical for drug discovery. It's being deployed to discover new proteins. It's being applied right now to do better diagnostics in healthcare. We've been using artificial intelligence in the finance industry for 30 years. There are many applications for artificial intelligence that don't fit the narrow definition that you just gave us. It's certainly true in digital media. Companies like Google use AI to encourage us to click more. That's true. That's also true with your Netflix feed, and we encounter it every single day. One of the reasons it's so hard to quit something like Facebook is that your attention is in a battle against one of the most powerful AIs that's deployed right now. And guess what? You're going to lose that battle. The AI is smarter than you, and it's going to win. So these tools can be used in a lot of different ways. But I think it would be a gross overstatement to say that that's the only way they're being used. And moreover, I think we'd be missing part of the story to say that we're not using artificial intelligence in ways that help us make better decisions. Ultimately, that's what these are. They're prediction machines, and they're designed to help us make better decisions.
One of the interesting debates that's going on at the moment, big tech firms' share prices have all slumped in the last couple of weeks. because Wall Street is starting to get a bit alarmed at the possibility that the trillions of dollars that have been spent in developing large language models are not going to have any commercial payback. I do find it interesting that I and a lot of the people I know use GPT-4 or other large language models every day, but I know an awful lot of people who very rarely use them. They've used them 2 or 3 times. They couldn't get that much out of it. It didn't do exactly what they wanted, and they're not really interested in persevering. They don't enjoy them. And so they've left them alone. And it may be that it is going to be a bit like the dot-com bubble, in that an awful lot of money will be spent creating an infrastructure which will be fantastically useful, but it won't have a short-term payback, and therefore the bubble will burst, the valuations will go down a lot. These firms are all big enough, they'll probably survive, but some of the sort of smaller ones who are supplying picks and shovels, maybe they'll go out of business. Or maybe GPT-5 and whatever's next from Google and from Meta and so on, maybe they will remove the last bits of friction for the majority of people. And so the majority of people will start to find the tools as useful as I do, and I imagine you do.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, they're a tremendously useful tool.
Can I give a slightly different perspective, Calum?
Yeah.
I think you have to think of this as sort of the ages, the various technology ages. We used to talk about the space age and the atomic age, and now we've got the computing age, and now we're moving into the autonomous age or the AI age or whatever you want to call it. But if you think about the leading industrial economies at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, essentially these were people with networks for accessing resources. There was the factory element that came in and so forth as part of the Industrial Revolution. So if we take that paradigm to the fourth Industrial Revolution, then the economies that are really going to be successful and separate themselves are those that are going to find advantages in being much more efficient and much more productive, and also reacting to the macro changes like energy level changes and so forth. And when you look at that, there's very few economies that have got now this mission for making these changes as quickly as the environment and the markets are creating them. And they tend to be players that we've talked about before. China, most certainly, Dubai, UAE, Saudi Arabia. These are economies that are really doubling down on trying to apply every new piece of technology to give themselves some economic advantage. I think you're going to have that separation, and economies that are stuck in the old industrial revolution sort of thinking, countries like my home, Australia, and the United States, trying to protect those industrial resources companies and so forth. I think they're really going to struggle. And I think that's where you're going to see the real application of this sorts of intelligence. And what we're seeing in China is image recognition has really solved a lot of crime. It's made road management and things, policing, emergency services much more efficient. This is sort of industrial level AI. It doesn't really relate to what the Silicon Valley companies and so forth are doing. Supply chain automation is going to be the next thing. I think that's where we're going to see a step change rather than it being the sorts of AI that you talk about when we talk about ChatGPT or the algorithms that are creating art and music and so forth. It's the industrial level AI, which is actually going to be the building blocks of these next generation economies.
So you're predicting a new set of winners and losers. And the losers won't just be people who you described earlier as techno-Luddites, who say, we don't want technology. They'll be the people who try to use technology but don't do it very well. They struggle with it. And the bureaucracy or the regulations or the general atmosphere means they don't do much with it. And then they'll be overtaken by the new winners who you're suggesting might be countries in the Gulf region, might be China. Am I reading you right?
Rob and I have this debate on the show as well. If you put it in the context of China's preparedness to become a highly autonomous 21st century economy, China is clearly on a trajectory very different from the West. Last year, China deployed half of all the solar energy deployed globally. They deployed more solar in 1 year last year than the US has deployed in its entire history. They are getting ready for this next level of global competition based on emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence.
But isn't the US joining them in that rapid progress with the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, but only in very specific areas is the US now competing. They're trying to stop China from getting access to chips because their growth is too fast and things like this. But why aren't they adopting policies to make a macro change for solar and renewables in the US? Obviously, commercially, in places like Texas and California, renewables are growing because they are the cheapest form of electricity to produce. But there's no federal coherent initiative on this like you see in China.
I thought that's exactly what the IRA was. I thought that's exactly what it does.
It does, but in terms of actions, you haven't seen the deployment of capital and things like that in infrastructure anywhere near what you've seen in China.
That's a question of political philosophy.
Yeah, it is. It is.
In the United States, no one looks to the United States government to take the lead. And when the United States government does attempt to take the lead in advancing new technologies, it often fails and it gets criticized for that. What Brett is excited about in China is a byproduct of the fact that it's an authoritarian dictatorship where you have one leader who can make a decision about what the country needs to do. As long as that person's making good decisions, that could be a very effective strategy because they don't have to deal with the messy political process. They simply do what the leader says. But if that leader makes a mistake, or if they bet on the wrong technology, or if they bet on the wrong format of the technology, or if they fall prey to the many types of execution risks that are inherent in deploying that technology at scale, then that one leader is going to find himself in trouble, and they'll find themselves perhaps on the wrong end of the equation. That's a possibility, right? We don't know this is future scenarios that we're talking about right now. But in the United States, what we have historically done is our government doesn't lead. They let the free market lead, for better or for worse. And there's many examples of how it's worked out well. There's also plenty of examples of how the United States has been a laggard and had to catch up over time. I think the conversation we're having about other countries is quite interesting because I think every national government has to face this decision. You just look at the European Union, they have been very good about regulating. That's been kind of at the forefront of everyone's imagination, political imagination in Europe. Regulating privacy, regulating data, regulating the use of advertising, regulating the bundling of software, regulating monopolies, and now attempting to regulate artificial intelligence. But what I've heard from friends of mine in the EU is that Europe gets the regulation and the United States gets the employment. The US gets the jobs because we don't regulate any of that stuff. So you have three different philosophies. China, top-down autocracy, where decisions are made by the leadership, they're enforced throughout the economy. United States, almost the opposite, free market, laissez-faire government approach. And the European approach, which is to regulate in a kind of preemptive way before we really know how these technologies might work or how they might affect things. And what that seems to do is affect employment and growth. Now, I might be wrong about that as well, because just to offer a countervailing view, we tend to think of France as kind of the poster child for heavy-handed government regulation. But actually, Paris is now the locale of a number of open source AI companies that are extremely interesting, Hugging Face, Mistral, and so forth. So I could be wrong about that as well.
Yeah, I think I have to offer some defense of the EU. It is true that the EU isn't as dynamic an economy as the US. There's some appalling data that the US and Europe used to be about the same size economies about 20 years ago, and now the EU is about half the size of the economy of the US. However, what the EU primarily does, the organization based in Brussels, its main role is to create a single market. And an awful lot of the regulations that it passes are about creating the single market, which will enable the EU to be competitive with America and China, because that's the great asset that both of those areas have. They're huge, huge single markets, and Europe isn't. It's fractured by language and by historic regulations and so on. There is a lot of dynamism in Europe. There are a lot of really smart people coming out of the universities, and there are promising companies growing, but we don't have the venture capital industry that you do. It's also actually true that although the EU has a reputation of being far more inclined to regulate AI than anybody else, lots of organizations in America, California, is not far behind the EU in the way it's regulating AI.
Let me tell you about California, man. It is driving the AI companies out of the state right now. There are a number of different, really poorly drafted legislative proposals under consideration in the California Assembly, which is our legislature.
So the EU, it isn't an outlier as much as people say. And also China really heavily regulates the way people do things. The AI companies, they all got a huge slap on the wrist and got told to stop working on consumer apps and to reorient to more deep technology. So It isn't really true that the EU is just all about regulation and nobody else does any regulation. That is a bit of a myth.
Okay, but Calum, you have to then answer this. There isn't a Google in the EU. There's no Microsoft in the EU. There's no Apple in the EU. Name a big software company, apart from SAP, name one big software company based anywhere in the EU. The answer is there are none.
Oh, it's a perfectly fair point. And I have a funny bit in my keynotes when I say, here's the Magnificent Seven in the US, and here's the BAT in China. And then I put up a blank slide and say, here's all the great European tech giants. Actually, it's a bit unfair because Spotify is kind of maybe a tech giant and it's European.
Not a very profitable company.
No, it's a fair point. But I would say I think the really big reason why Europe doesn't have a tech giant is because we don't have a single market yet. It's a work in progress. If you are in Italy and you create a brilliant piece of software, if you want to sell that in Germany and France and Sweden and, God forbid, the UK post-Brexit, you've got to deal with different languages, you've got to deal with different regulatory processes, different histories. Whereas if you create a great bit of software in Alabama, you can sell it in New York tomorrow, no problem. It's virtually frictionless. That's, I think, the main reason why we don't have big tech firms. That plus the venture capital industry is much, much more liberated in the US.
There's also this. I'm advising 4 different AI startups right now. When the question of where should we set up our headquarters comes, we all agree, not California, because the regulatory environment looks unfavorable. And those regulations would be very difficult for a startup company in particular to conform with. But we also begin with the assumption that we're not going to have a presence in Paris or anywhere in France, Germany, any place in Europe that has labor laws that make it very difficult for a company to be dynamic and grow and shift and change personnel. Look, Europe is an awesome place to live. It's probably a great place to work because there are all sorts of worker protections, but those are a deterrent to innovative startup companies. They're simply not going to take root there. Evidence of that is the fact that so many European technologists and CEOs set up shop in the United States. But where California has been the haven for tech companies for 50 years, that looks like it's changing now, because the advice that I consistently see and give is steer clear of California. You don't really want to have a nexus in California if you can avoid it.
So is everybody going to Austin, Texas now?
Texas is appealing. Florida is appealing. Nevada is very appealing. Yeah, there are a number of states that basically compete with California to attract startup energy. And these days, post-pandemic, you can run a company from anywhere. So there isn't really that need to be geographically located. There's still a great concentration of technological talent and vision in the Bay Area. So, of course, they have that advantage. And that provides a kind of inertia that will continue for quite some time as long as those people are still working. But increasingly, we're hearing about people starting startup companies elsewhere.
I'd tell you 2 areas in Europe where we see advances being made ahead of Silicon Valley and ahead of the US, and that is in financial services and in many ways in next generation medicine 3.0 and healthcare stuff. We see a lot of really good gene therapy and stuff coming out of there. Of course, the US is competing in that. But on financial services, the 3 biggest challenger banks in the world and the biggest wallet schemes are all outside of the United States. So you've got Revolut, which is now 45 million customers, bigger than HSBC with 39 million. You've got Nubank in Brazil with 105, 110 million customers now across Latin America. They're coming into the States. And you've got WeBank in China with 450 million customers. We've got nothing like that really in the United States.
So, Brett, one of the reasons that's true is that those are 2 of the most regulated industries in the United States. And not to beat this theme to death, but since we've been talking about regulation, it's worth pointing out that the United States isn't very good at writing regulation. Every case where the United States government has written national regulation for an industry, it's resulted in regulatory capture and a decrease in innovation. That's certainly true in healthcare and in finance. And of course, creativity is going to move to the places where it's treated best. And so, of course, you're going to move out to another country to do that.
It's funny, isn't it, how we see things through our own lens. I think the reason why the US is behind in financial services is because you have a very, very strong tradition of local banking. Your concentration of banking is much, much lower than in Europe.
Yeah, but 75% of deposits are held by the top 20 banks in the US. So it gives that veneer of looking like that, but it's not the actual reality. It's the regulatory capture and the protection of the incumbents, which is slowing it down in the US. In the EU, At least what you've had is you've had licensing structures to allow these new experimental companies to come up and operate in this highly regulated space. In the US, there is no fintech charter. And so that's an interesting sort of side effect of regulation. When you start talking about these advanced systems that we're working on, I could see China and the EU coming up with advanced healthcare directives and next generation healthcare infrastructure based on shared data and so forth that you couldn't execute in the US, for example, because of the oligopoly healthcare structure there.
So what about in California? Are the regulators going to steer California into a backwater? Or are they going to realize, hey, we can't continue in this present course? It's going to have many worse consequences than we previously imagined.
The California legislature keeps coming up with new ways to make it difficult for startup companies to thrive here. So even though this is fertile soil for startup companies, our legislature is imposing work rules and employment rules, now regulations proposed for artificial intelligence. California led the way with a very aggressive data and privacy policy that companies here have to comply with. They're attempting to enforce that in an extraterritorial fashion as well. So they're trying to impose that on companies that operate elsewhere with some mixed success. But tax policy also is a factor here. If you're a startup entrepreneur and you're being paid in stock options, you probably don't want to be based in California because you're going to end up paying tremendous taxes when you realize those gains. This has become a political issue in the United States in the current campaigns. Donald Trump, I wouldn't say he stands for much, but one thing he seems to have done in the past when he was president is embrace free market economics, or more so than others. And he certainly attacked the regulatory state, where the Biden administration is now viewed as a villain by technology companies, particularly by VCs, because they have been enforcing antitrust. By the way, this is one area where the Europeans have been ahead of the United States for a long time because they have a functioning antitrust commission. The U.S. has basically had a dysfunctional antitrust enforcement for 20 years or more. That's what enabled these large companies to take over in every industry, not just tech. But as Brett pointed out, in a number of industries, about 75% of U.S. industries are dominated and highly concentrated today in the United States. Under the Biden administration, our Federal Trade Commission, which regulates antitrust, has been quite active, and they brought a number of antitrust cases. That's actually pit Silicon Valley investors and big tech investors against the Biden administration. So where historically they supported liberals, so they supported the Democratic Party, now they're openly supporting Trump, even though it seems to defy common sense.
Well, some of them are. Andreessen and Horowitz are, and Musk is, but for his own very particular reasons, because he hates transgender, and he's gone on this anti-woke crusade as a result of that.
But even Reid Hoffman
is still very solidly Democrat. He's pumping money into Kamala Harris like nobody's business.
But hang on. Reid Hoffman recently came out and basically gave an ultimatum to the Democratic Party, to Kamala Harris. He said, remove Lena Khan, who is the current chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, remove her, and I will unleash an enormous amount of election campaign financing. If that's not an overt quid pro quo that illustrates the corruption at the core of the U.S. government.
Yeah. Which is curiously actually not what Andreessen and Horowitz want, because they want big tech to be broken up, ideally. They don't like the idea of these behemoths because they think they strangle the startups that they support. They don't mind Lena Khan so much. It's the regulations against the startups that they're angry about.
They say that, but if you look at their biggest investments, what they're really looking for is building new monopolies. They really seem to be intent on that.
Yeah. Everybody does, yeah.
It is an interesting topic, but anyway, it's kind of spilled into the political domain, so we'll see what happens in this election cycle.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
The final question I'd like to ask is to circle back right to our discussion at the beginning about there being so much media these days, and there's so much good media as well. What would either of you, Brett or Rob, like to say as a reason why our listeners should spend some of their precious time listening to your Futurist show as well?
Our show is focused on really two main things. We want to introduce people who are thinking about and shaping the future. People who are not just talking about the future, but actually doing something about it. We like to bring that to our audience's attention because there are so many different ways to do that. We're motivated by the conviction that we need more people thinking more athletically about the future. So the second point is that when we talk to people on our show, we always ask them, what is your methodology for envisioning or understanding or anticipating the future? And it's surprising to see that everybody has a different methodology, and that can be quite instructive as well. So we would urge those of your audience who are future-minded to check out the Futurist Podcast, because there you'll find a diversity of voices working in a number of different fields, as well as science fiction authors and other people who pontificate about the future. But the main point there is ways to think about the future more athletically, how to apply that in your own life.
That is a great strapline on which to end. Thinking athletically about the future. That's really good. Rob and Brett, thank you very much for joining us on the London Futurist Podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.